Now, we discussed the role of thyroid gland in the regulation of your metabolism, metabolic rate. It also, as we will see in a bit, participates in the regulation of calcium levels. But I suggest we're not getting ahead of ourselves. And we're going to start the regulation of calcium with a conversation about parathyroid. So, let's say for some reason, okay, the concentration of calcium in the blood decreases. Okay, that results in the direct stimulation of parathyroid gland, which produces parathyroid hormone. So within the parathyroid gland, there are two types of cells. Parathyroid HU cells, they produce parathyroid hormone, which is not present. What? No, I mean, it's going to be logical. Something's wrong. Another type of cells that are oxyphil cells, they function as under. So in blood calcium drops, parathyroid cells release parathyroid hormone. It has three effects. So effect number one, it inhibits osteoblasts, stimulates osteoclasts, and we have bone resorption, which means calcium is delivered into the bloodstream. it also acts on kidneys. So it effectively takes the calcium back from the urine into the bloodstream. It's called, you can say, one term is it increases calcium retention or calcium reabsorption. And then there's an effect of parathyroid hormone in kidneys, so that they release calcitriol, also known as vitamin D. Hold on a second. Okay, so just a little note, I'm going to put it over here. Interestingly enough, calcitriol is a hormone, because calcitriol, in turn, acts on your intestines. So your intestines can absorb more calcium from fluid. Now, calcitriol is produced, well, it's not a vitamin, okay. Calcitriol is produced by kidneys from vitamin D. Okay, but if you don't have vitamin D in your diet, your calcitriol levels will be low. And I have my own way to sort of present this. Calcium is, in this for example, is equivalent to money. If you're running low on money, you have three options. Option number one, you can tap into savings. Okay? Option number two, you try to spend less. And option number three, find a better paying job. Okay? So increased salary. Okay? And PTH contributes to all three of them. Okay? Good? Now, how can you become hypocalcemic? What is the primary driver for hypocalcemia? Is that genetics? Is that diet? Is that... It's diet. It's diet. Low calcium in the diet can drive hypocalcemia. Now, here's another question. I don't know how many of you heard it. We talked about it, I think, in the bone. If you're going to drink 5 gallons of milk a day, your bones are not going to be any better, because all excess of calcium is going to be passed with the feces or urine. Okay? So hypocalcemia can be triggered by a diet. Hypercalcemia, probably not. Very rare. For the most part, hypercalcemic states are achieved due to some tumors. So, but anyway, let's say you have a minor fluctuation of calcium in the blood, whatever happened. Okay, your kidneys, so there's something wrong with the kidney, whatever, doesn't matter. So, in response to elevated calcium in the blood, hear me out, very clear, your thyroid gland, not parathyroid, thyroid, specifically its parafollicular cells, will release a hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin stimulates osteoblasts that deposit the bone, inhibits osteoclasts that remove the bone, so they don't remove it anymore, just deposition. So your bones take all the calcium out of the blood and get it deposited into the bone. Okay? It's really not common. Okay? Am I making sense? So just a reminder, so a few things. Calcium in the blood is one of the most important parameters because it controls a lot of nerve signaling and so on. So even the small but sustained reduced concentrations of calcium will drive PTH concentration, okay, through the roof, okay? So this is your normal level, and even small changes. See how tightly calcium is regulated. You see how quickly calcitonin shoots up if calcium is chronically up, how quickly PTH goes up if the calcium is down. Okay. Just a reminder, effects of hypocalcemia, basically hypercontractility, tetanus, contraction of respiratory muscles, and death. Hypercalcemia has opposite effects. It makes your muscles weak. It also facilitates the production of kidney stones. So let's go over some adrenal gland and leave the rest. I want to see where we are position-wise. Yeah, and leave the rest for the next week. So adrenal gland consists of the outer cortex and the inner medulla. So in this illustration here, you can see the inner medulla and the outer cortex. Now we in our conversation is going to focus only on the cortical hormones. You ask, why? The answer to this is Unit 3, peripheral nervous system. When we were talking about autonomic nervous system, we mentioned epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are two water-soluble hormones that are produced in the adrenal medulla due to the acute stress. Already covered it. There's no point in repeating it again. So we're going to focus on cortical hormone. Like medullary hormone, cortical are all lipid-soluble. They are all derived from cholesterol. But turns out your cortex is divided into three zones, functionally and somewhat anatomically different zones. The most superficial zone, zona glomerulosa, produces aldosterone, which belongs to mineralocorticoid hormones, hormones that regulate a balance of ions, mostly sodium and potassium. One zone deeper is zona fasciculata, which produces glucocorticoids. And as you can guess from the name, glucocorticoids are responsible. So they respond to long-term stress, but they respond to it by increasing availability of glucose and fatty acids, basically increasing the energy availability. And then the deepest zone, zona reticularis, produces androgens that are somewhat important for masculinization, but can be can lead to certain abnormalities. Okay. Now let's talk about aldosterone. Okay. So this is one of my favorite hormones, and actually, what I want to do, I want to write it down myself, okay, if you don't mind. So aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid that controls, first, levels sodium content. The thing is, quick reminder, do you remember what osmosis is? Movement of water towards higher concentration of solids. One of the main solids in the extracellular fluid and blood is sodium. So, hear me out. Imagine you have two compartments, okay? You have one compartment that has very little sodium and a lot of water. Okay, and then you have another compartment that has more sodium, meaning that there's less water. Okay? So, osmotically, water will diffuse, if it can, obviously, from one compartment to another. Okay? Good so far, everybody? So I use the phrase that water follows sodium. Since sodium has such a capacity to draw water to itself, its concentration in your blood doesn't really change. Okay? So look at this. I'm running a bit ahead of trigger. This is the urinary excretion of sodium. Okay? When aldosterone is applied, urinary excretion of sodium goes down. But then eventually stabilizes. Because first you draw sodium back in the blood, but then you draw blood. Am I making sense? You draw blood back. Sorry, you draw water back. And it means that sodium that moved to blood gets diluted. So all in all, concentration doesn't really change, but the content does. And that's something to consider as well. So let's go back to this. What will be the stimulus? The stimulus will be low sodium content. Okay? I love talking about it because it shows how holistic the regulation is logical function. Sodium content is low. That triggers aldosterone production. Okay? And what aldosterone does, it increases sodium retention in kidneys. So sodium goes back in the blood. Okay? Now what follows sodium? So it will also increase water retention. Now, before I move on, let me pause and ask you. When we increase sodium retention in kidneys and we bring sodium back in the body, do we increase sodium content? Yes. So this is your negative feedback. Low sodium content, aldosterone, increased retention, increased sodium content. So I'm going to do sort of a Okay, so far we're good. Okay, good. Now when you retain water, what happens to your blood volume? Again? Yes. So your blood volume, BV, increases. When your blood volume increases, what happens to your blood pressure? Yeah, increases. Okay. So if these are also outcomes, what are two other stimuli for aldosterone release? If aldosterone increases blood pressure, the stimulus is low blood pressure. If the outcome is low blood volume, high blood volume, what is the stimulus? Low blood volume. Blood loss, yes. I wasn't sure if I can feed it in. Okay? Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, there is another completely separate situation. Do you know any foods that are naturally radioactive? Because I do. Yeah, they're not radioactive to the, like, you're going to die radioactive. But they are. If you eat, if you eat that food regularly over the year, it's like a plane flight. No. It's bananas. Bananas. Any food that is rich in potassium, bananas are incredibly rich in potassium. Very weakly radioactive, because potassium is radioactive. In fact, the dose of potassium that is contained in like 5 bananas is the same dose that is used for capital punishment in the United States. The lethal injection is potassium chloride. So why don't we die after 5 bananas? The answer is potassium is key. The answer is aldosterone. So when potassium levels in your blood start rising, it also stimulates aldosterone. And aldosterone very quickly turns up potassium excretion. Does that make sense? Like getting rid of it, the kidneys. No. I mean, you can't conceivably eat enough bananas to have any reason, because you have a lot of radioactivity exposure just from the, like if you fly often, you have elevated exposure to radiation. You know, you do x-rays, you do CT scans, like, you know, all of that is exposure. Bananas and potatoes are low. Okay. And come on, we live in Cleveland. Like, that's not the city to be concerned about bananas. Have you been to Steelyard? Where we decided to build that mall right near the plant. So yeah, that basically, this is what I was referring to in terms of potassium regulation. Basically, I just drew it. A couple more things. Aldosterone is a steroid hormone. So the receptor is in the cytoplasm of a cell. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, if you think about aldosterone, right? If you produce too much, what you're going to have? You have hypertension. Because aldosterone increases blood pressure. Okay? So little hypertension. Okay? Now, muscle weakness due to hypocalcemia. In this case, hypercalcemia results in the cardiac toxicity. So this is how people are. Like capital punishment in the U.S. It's the injection of the sleep medicine, I think painkillers, and potassium chloride, which effectively sends the heart into cardiac fibrillation, ventricular fibrillation. Okay? But what I wanted to say, if aldosterone, when increased, causes elevated blood pressure, maybe we can do something about aldosterone to regulate blood pressure in people with primary hypertension. And this is spironolactone. You see that? This drug inhibits aldosterone receptor, which means aldosterone does not contain sodium, does not retain sodium, which means sodium is being passed, water is being passed, blood volume decreases, and that is one of the most effective ways to control blood pressure in hypertensive people. Okay? Yeah. So, next time, we're going to continue with the cortisol. Again, depends on how muscle examine. So folks, so far we covered zona glomerulosa, which secretes one of the steroid, sorry, not steroid, but, well, technically it's a steroid hormone, mineralocorticoid, aldosterone. Now we are moving on to zona fasciculata, which releases cortisol. So, indirectly, cortisol is the hormone responsible for the stress responses. Now, stress can be positive, can be negative, but the most important point that I want to make about cortisol is that it is produced in response to chronic stress rather than acute stress. just a reminder, the hormones of the acute stress are epinephrine and norepinephrine that are produced by adrenal medulla. This will be our sort of last mention of these two hormones, and we're going to focus on cortisol entirely. Epinephrine and norepinephrine. So stress can be either psychological, for instance, you have to juggle multiple jobs and family and stuff. It can be physical, starting from surgery and ending with hypokinesia or trauma or hypo or hyperthermia. So the important part here, okay, is what we call a hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So it all starts in the hypothalamus, which is, as a part of your brain, responsible for the physiological responses to emotions. And stress is scientifically an emotion. The situation that can seem stressful to one person may not be such for another. In response to this long-term stress, the hypothalamus produces corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, which then acts on the anterior pituitary, releasing ACTH. So ACTH, or corticotropin, make it a little more presentable. So first of all, the name, corticotropin, we talked about that. Tropin means where it goes, and cortico stands for cortex. So it stimulates adrenal cortex. What does ACTH stand for? It stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. So ACTH acts on, that is produced by the anterior pituitary gland, acts on the adrenal cortex, which in response to ACTH produces cortisol. So the effects of cortisol, because, how do you deal with long-term stress from the physiological perspective? You need to mobilize resources. And this mobilization of resources is generation of glucose, breakdown of protein, for energy, breakdown of fat. Now, since it stabilizes lysosomes, means that it impairs immune responses. So we're going to go back to this. Now, just in like any other axis that we've seen before, cortisol has a negative feedback exerted on hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland. So as you can imagine, elevated levels of cortisol will result in the reduced levels of corticotropin releasing hormone and the reduced levels of ACTH. Now, one of the conditions that is driven by the stress is hypertension, elevated blood pressure. How does that work? Turns out that during the long-term stress response, not only glucocorticoids, namely cortisol, are stimulated, but also mineralocorticoids are triggered as well. So these mineralocorticoids, the ones that we were talking about before, the aldosterone hormone, they retain sodium and water, which result in the increase of blood volume and increase in blood pressure. So as you can see, the stress stimulation acts on both zones of adrenal cortex. Zona glomerulosa, which produces mineralocorticoids, and zona fasciculata, that produces glucocorticoids. But why do we call them glucocorticoids? So it turns out this hormone, cortisol, results in the increased gluconeogenesis. Bear with me, we're going to explain what this term means. Glycogenolysis, increased breakdown of proteins, increased lipolysis. So if you're stressed, you need energy to deal with this stress. Energy comes mostly from glucose. So gluconeogenesis is the process, when you start thinking about that name, of making glucose from scratch. Gluconeogenesis, making. Glycogenolysis is a breakdown of glycogen. During that process, glucose is generated. Protein catabolism, it doesn't have any specific name. Obviously, when you break down protein, you can use amino acids as the source of energy. And lipolysis is the breakdown of fat. Now, all these processes are internal, they happen in the body, and you need to know the meaning of these words. So if during an exam you ask me what gluconeogenesis is, I'm not going to help you, with all due respect, okay? I'm going to tell you that you must know that word. And another source of energy that you can get is food. So food intake also increases. Now, the processes that are opposite to the ones that we just listed, such as glycolysis, which is opposite to gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis, synthesis of proteins, which is opposite to protein catabolism, and lipogenesis, which is opposite to lipolysis. These processes are reduced in their intensity. Now, when you start looking at the response to stress, it happens actually pretty quickly, okay? In minutes, you see an increase of the concentrations of cortisol both in the adrenal cortex and in the blood. Since cortisol is a lipid-soluble hormone, its receptor is located in the cytoplasm. Again, I mentioned that before. I will never ask you to distinguish between the cytoplasm and the nucleus. As long as you know that it's inside the cell, you're fine. So this complex of the receptor and the hormone enters the nucleus and initiates transcription and then translation. Now, for the reasons that I still try to comprehend, I placed the regulation of basal metabolic rate under the cortisol and not thyroid hormone, so I guess we're going to have to cover that. So that actually goes into thyroid hormones, but let's talk about basal metabolic rate, okay? So what is the basal metabolic rate. This is the energy that you spend when you do absolutely nothing. So there are many different complicated forms you can calculate here. There's a bunch of different approaches to calculate basal metabolic rate. I actually checked, compared them. They aren't very different. The convenience of Harris and Benedict approach, as well as Mifflin's and Jer, is that they actually take into account the person's age, which is important, and the person's height, which is even importanter. Because think of it this way. I am, say, 68 inches tall and weigh 195 pounds. If I am 7 feet tall and weigh 195 pounds, I'm emaciated. If I'm 5 feet tall and weigh 195 pounds, I'm obese. So taking those factors into account means that, they can account for basically how much fat a person has or how much muscle a person has. So, our metabolism is responsible for regulating our body temperature. Just in general, there are two temperatures, two body temperatures. One of them is called core, one of them is called shell. Shell temperature is on the skin. Core temperature is inside of your body. So when you measure the temperature, why the oral or rectal measurements the most accurate is because that's as close to the inside as you can get. I mean, ideally, you should be able to swallow some kind of a probe and it would measure temperature strictly inside your body, but that's a bit of a stretch for, procedure like that. Okay? Now, what about survivability? The temperature range survivability. This is an example of how robust the human body is. The normal ranges for pretty much all physiological parameters are pretty narrow. For instance, the normal range for body temperature is about 35.5 to 38, give or take. Okay? All in Celsius. The survivable range, so this needs to be updated. I can translate it into Fahrenheit terms. There are reports of people who were hospitalized with a body temperature of 115. 115. 115. 115. And they survived. No. Interestingly enough, well, I don't know if no brain damage was recorded because there was no brain in the first place, but they survived, essentially. And this body temperature was the result of some kind of infection. Okay? Now, what is more dangerous? High temperature, hyperthermia, or hypothermia? Hyper, of course, because that may very quickly cause denaturation of proteins and this and that. So hypothermia is used during surgical procedures, and there is actually an expression among people who are emergency medical technicians, which states, one is not dead until they warm and dead. There was a case of a woman here in Cleveland who got lost in the winter and was found in the winter, and when EMTs came to rescue, her body temperature was 20 degrees Celsius, which is 68 Fahrenheit. And in order to separate that woman from the ground, they had to use shovels because she froze to the ground. She was brought to Cleveland Clinic, heated up. No apparent damage to any organs. Was alive. Yes. So, what affects your basal metabolic rate? These graphs illustrate, first of all, the age differences and BMI differences. So, what reduces your basal metabolic rate? The older you get, the lower it is. It starts declining about the ripe age of 30 to 35. Increased percentage of fat, obesity, and females have a lower metabolic rate. That's it. Factors that increase it include stress, release of thyroid hormone, increased consumption of oxygen because it usually signals increased metabolism in general, increased body temperature, increased muscle mass, and certain types of foods. So alcohol and protein-rich foods increase BMR. Now, to be fair, if you think that alcohol in your beer will offset the calories, it won't. Training. Any exercise increases BMR. But, so this actually kind of interesting. Resistance training that is followed by aerobic reduces BMR, which I cannot comment on this. So let me put it this way. When you exercise, you put yourself into oxygen debt. In order to compensate for that oxygen debt, your body increases BMR. That effect lasts for a fair amount of time. It lasts longer after the resistance training. So from the perspective of loss of body weight, loss of fat, resistance training is superior to aerobic exercise. Now let's go back to corticosteroids and consider the pathologies. There are two main pathologies associated with cortisol. Overproduction, which is called Cushing's disease. It results in so-called moon phase, buffalo hump, central obesity, and hypertension. We kind of discussed, cortisol will lead to that. Chronic deficit of cortisol, known as Addison disease. Fatigue, muscle weakness, reduced blood pressure, and skin darkening. The famous person who suffered from this condition was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And I don't know if it's not a very well-known fact, but during his presidency, he was on corticosteroids. Okay? Now, zona reticularis. It is kind of a useless zone. Not completely useless. It produces androgens. But it produces androgens in fairly low amounts, and they just support the androgens that are produced by the gonads. The role in women and men is not clear, but in women who go through the menopause, androgens that are supplied by the adrenal cortex may actually partially replace the estrogen that is not produced to the same level by the ovaries anymore. A very interesting syndrome that is associated with this part of the adrenal cortex is called or adrenogenital syndrome. So complete lack of corticosteroids. Complete lack of corticosteroids means that if you look at the what you might call it, negative feedback loop. If you cancel cortisol, then there is no inhibition, and it means that the levels of CRH and ACTH both are going to go up. So, as we mentioned before, adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates all layers of the adrenal cortex, which means the levels of ACTH will result in the stimulation of adrenal cortex, its overgrowth, increased production of androgens, and masculinizations in females, like in this image. In males, it will result in the ambiguous external genitalia condition known as hypospadias. Okay, so here in this image you can see very much reduced in size penis and the residual vagina. Now we're kind of wrapping up anterior pituitary, and we're going to jump to posterior pituitary gland, which, as you remember, does not produce hormones. It stores and releases them. Two hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary gland are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So how do they get there? Hypothalamus has neurosecretory cells. These are effectively neurons. These neurons produce hormones that end up in the posterior pituitary and wait for the signal to be released. First one is oxytocin. By first one I mean, we're just going to cover it now. This is the only hormone which release is regulated via positive feedback loop. When in the beginning of labor, sort of weak Braxton Hicks contractions, what's up? I cannot hear you. No. It's a hormone that is indeed used to induce labor. But look at this. The contractions of the uterus, okay? Contractions of the uterus, they stimulate oxytocin release from the posterior pituitary, which in turn stimulates uterus to contract. So contractions stimulate oxytocin release, which stimulates the uterus to contract, and it goes on and on and on. Positive feedback, right? So baby is released. Now, oxytocin has another function regulating the ejection of milk, which we aren't covering here. It has been implicated into some behavioral and emotional regulations, but it's I don't want to say it's not true. I want to say that the data is indirect. Let's put it this way. And there's very little data in humans. There are some data in animals suggesting that oxytocin may regulate behavioral patterns and play a role in development of autistic behaviors. But in humans, it's kind of inconclusive. So now, what about antidiuretic hormone? So let's say you are dehydrated. It means that the concentration of all the solutes in your blood and extracellular fluid increases. In response to that increase, antidiuretic hormone is released from the posterior pituitary. That results in increased reabsorption of water in the kidneys. So kidneys take the water out of the urine and bring it back into the blood. Okay? That brings the osmolality back to normal. Now, as you can see, other two stimuli, which are inextricably linked, is reduced blood volume and reduced blood pressure. So antidiuretic hormone is one of many hormones that regulate your blood pressure. If you, for instance, donate blood and your blood volume decreases, you're going to produce antidiuretic hormone, which will stimulate kidneys to reabsorb water, increasing your blood volume and blood pressure. Another function of ADH is the constriction of blood vessels, which contributes to the regulation of blood pressure, but we're not going into these woods so far. Now, an important, and obviously, if you are overhydrated, you can flip all the arrows in this line that is heavily highlighted by yellow and have the picture, the regulation picture in front of you. Now, first of all, think about you being dehydrated. You are producing very small amount of urine, and it's concentrated because all the water is being taken out from the urine back in the blood. So the volume of urine decreases while the concentration increases. There are drugs that inhibit the actions of ADH. Most notable of those is alcohol. Now, you can try this experiment yourself, but if you will drink the amount of alcohol in the form of beer, obviously, let's say you are aiming at 2 fluid ounces of pure alcohol, okay? So you have to drink certain volume of beer, and it's going to be, pretty substantial volume. Maybe, a couple of pints, something like that. And if you drink a couple of pints of water, you're going to go pee. So, no surprise, you're going to go pee up the beer. But if you drink that amount of alcohol by consuming hard liquor, you're also going to go pee. Because that peeing is largely due to the inhibition of antidiuretic hormone, which fails to take the water out of your pee, so you produce large volumes of diluted urine, which means you're losing water, and this is why you have a hangover in the morning. Okay, makes sense? Now, the condition associated with antidiuretic hormone is underproduction. So, in this case, patients who underproduced ADH constantly release vast volumes of urine that is very diluted and constantly feel thirsty because they're losing water all the time. Now we are moving to pancreas. Not all the cell types that are in the pancreas, you need to know, I'm just going to mention, so pancreas is both endo and exocrine gland. Its exocrine function is to produce digestive enzymes, and endocrine function so the cell types that are found in pancreas that are endocrine are all located within the islets of Langerhans. You can see a typical islet of Langerhans right here and right here. Just so you feel better, I'm not going to ask you to identify individual cell types within. As long as you can see the islet of Langerhans on the anatomy exam, you're good. Okay? So what are those cells? So alpha cells secrete a glucagon, hormone that increases your blood glucose in response to low blood glucose. Beta cells that produce insulin, which decreases glucose concentration in the blood in response to high blood glucose. Delta cells produce somatostatin, or growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which inhibits insulin release and is produced in response to ghrelin and orocortin, hormones that are produced when you are hungry. And it makes sense, so insulin does not take, the sugar out of your blood. PP cells produce pancreatic polypeptide, which has regulatory power of the entire pancreatic secretion. Two hormones that I'm going to ask you about are these: glucagon and insulin. So I'm going to be very punctate here. On the right, you can see the insulin. It's a relatively small protein, and it is the first human protein that was synthesized from scratch, which is quite a feat. It is now produced via recombinant technology. So how does your pancreas know when to produce insulin? Well, in my opinion, this is one of the most elegant regulation pathways that exist in the human body. It all starts when blood glucose increases. Increased blood glucose means that more glucose enters the cells, the beta cells, in the pancreas. Let's make sure that. Increased glucose levels result in the increased intensity of glucose breakdown. Basically, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, and all of this leads to elevated levels of ATP. And in this case, ATP serves as the negative channel, negative ligand for potassium channels. So binding of ATP to potassium channels closes them, which means that potassium, which concentration is greater inside of the cell, cannot diffuse out of the cell. It accumulates in the cell, since potassium is positively charged. This accumulation of positive charge results in depolarization of this beta cell, and depolarization of the beta cell opens voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium, which concentration is greater outside of the cell, diffuses in, and just like in the neuron, results in the release of vesicles that contain insulin. So insulin now, in response to elevated glucose in the very beginning, insulin is released in the blood. So what are the effects of insulin? So insulin as a water-soluble hormone binds to its receptor, shown here. And this receptor is the type that contains tyrosine kinase. Tyrosine kinase is the enzyme that adds phosphate to proteins. So the addition of phosphate activates a bunch of enzymes, and it results in the, hear me out, removal of glucose from the blood. Now, the simple removal of glucose from the blood is just absurd. Think about you going grocery shopping. What you're effectively doing, you're removing food from a grocery store, right? But when you're buying food, you're not buying it to just take it out of the grocery store, right? You're going to use it. So insulin acts in the same way. First, it stimulates glucose uptake, which means glucose goes from blood to tissues. Then, it stimulates the glucose storage. You already you've heard that. The word is glycogenesis. It is increased synthesis of glycogen. Okay? Now, just like you bring food home and start cooking your dinner, glucose that enters your cells is used in the process of glycolysis, which is also increased. Now, when your glycogen storage is overwhelmed, I guess, your liver starts making fat in the process of lipogenesis. And quite obviously, processes that are opposite to the use and storage of glucose are inhibited, namely glycogenolysis, breakdown of glycogen, and gluconeogenesis. The intensity of these processes significantly goes down. Now, the feedback loop is kind of boring, because in response to elevated blood glucose, right, insulin takes the glucose out of the blood, and that's it. Blood glucose levels go down. Now, these are some interesting graphs that I want you to appreciate. So, after the stimulation with the glucose, blood insulin levels spike and then steadily increase over time. You can also see that the insulin secretion is dose dependent. The more glucose end up in your blood, the higher the levels of insulin that your pancreas is going to generate. Now, what's really cool is that you can see that if you increase extracellular glucose, most cells, and I'm going to clarify it, most cells in your body will not be able to take it in if they are not provided with insulin. Only if insulin is present, the increase in extracellular glucose will cause the increase in intracellular glucose. One sort of a footnote here. you have organs that can uptake glucose without insulin. Those are muscles. This is why one of the best ways to control blood glucose is exercise. So after the meal, if you go even for a walk, 5-10 minutes walk, that exercise is enough to significantly lower your blood glucose. Okay? Now, another important factor, another important role of insulin, it cooperates with growth hormone. So I really like that graph. So you have experimental rats that don't have a pancreas and don't have hypophysis or pituitary gland. So effectively, they do not produce growth hormone and they do not produce insulin. Now, if you start giving those rats growth hormone, they don't grow. Their body weight doesn't change. If you give them only insulin, same. But if you combine growth hormone and insulin, their body weight starts to increase. This is why, by the way, professional bodybuilders use both growth hormone and insulin for muscle development. So what can stimulate? What can stimulate insulin? It's anabolic hormone. So increased blood glucose, increased blood fatty acids, increased amino acids. All of these are coming from food. Basically, insulin spikes after the food. Hormones that are produced in response to food. Growth hormone, cortisol, even glucagon will stimulate insulin just in case glucagon will increase blood glucose too much. Okay? Sulfonylurea drugs, these are used to treat diabetes. Okay? So, effectively, Ozempic is not an insulin promoter, but it has kind of insulin-like effects. Insulin inhibits your appetite. Think about this. You ate something, insulin spikes and tells you, hey, put down the fork, right? So the drug, the acting drug in the Ozempic does very similar thing. Okay? So, diabetes. This is the old map. Both of them, actually. Okay? So, percent of obesity. What is the healthiest state in the US? Based on the body weight. Now, if you look at this data, Colorado is 20 to 24.9, not anymore. They went over 25%. Okay? What is the most obese state in the US? I call it the obesity belt, yes. In some of them, by the way, obesity went over 40% at this point. Anyone dares to guess which state? Wasn't a fair question. West Virginia, hear me out. No. This is why. West Virginia, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, they compete for the first place. Mostly Louisiana and West Virginia. This is bad. Okay? So yeah, we have, it's kind of interesting that everything east of the Rockies is pretty bad, and west of the Rockies isn't as much. Yeah, Ohio's pretty bad. Yeah. We are definitely above 30, if not above 35. Okay? So, and if you will look at the rates of diabetes, they kind of go hand in hand with obesity. Why? Because there are two types of diabetes. Autoimmune diabetes and not autoimmune diabetes. So type 1 is autoimmune. Usually diagnosed early, and in this case beta cells do not produce insulin, end of story. Okay? Am I making sense? I mean, it's not the fault of their own. Now, quick thing, just for all of you to be aware of that. Since it's autoimmune, it usually is diagnosed early. However, there's a series of very robust studies showing that immune dysregulation caused by COVID-19 results in the dramatic increase of the risk to develop type 1 diabetes. Oh, later than that, 30s, 40s, 50s. So, type 1, yeah. So people who have especially the condition known as long COVID, they basically have their immune system reprogrammed and not in the way they want. So these reprogrammed hyperinflammatory cells. Now, nobody knows the mechanisms. It's not like we know exactly what happens. But the spike in autoimmune disorders suggests that there's a reprogramming of probably T cells that destroy your pancreas and cause type 1 diabetes. Now, type 2 is usually diabetes in adults, okay? Makes sense? And it is lifestyle, but also genetics. So, we have an ongoing, I wouldn't call it a feud, but an argument with a good friend of mine, who's also a colleague up in Lakeland. I insist that there's a genetic component, like people can develop type 2 diabetes without violating the good diet. He insists that not, we couldn't find any data. So it's kind of an obsolete conversation. But for the most part, what happens, think about this. You start eating a lot of simple carbs, which means your blood glucose is elevated all the time. That means your pancreas produces a lot of insulin, which means the insulin receptors get a lot of signal, and eventually they get used to it. They develop resistance, insulin resistance. Does that make sense? So, if receptors are resistant, glucose uptake is inhibited, which means, look at this, in people without diabetes, you give them glucose, glucose levels in the blood spike, and then they go back to normal after 2 hours. In people who are insulin resistant, you give them glucose, the glucose spike and stays up for an extended period of time, because, like in a boy who cried wolf fairy tale, these receptors do not respond to insulin. And what's interesting, the whole idea of treating type 2 diabetes with insulin is like trying to extinguish fire with gas. Because as you start adding more insulin, those receptors become more and more resistant. What actually works the best is high intensity exercise. Okay? Both of this data show that the exercise intensity and time critical, okay? And actually people with type 2 diabetes, if they wish, they can control their blood glucose by maintaining certain type of diet and exercising and, doing stuff like that. Okay? Make sense? One of the problems in diabetes is that this is an example of the rats that had the pancreas removed, mimicking type 1 diabetes, but it doesn't really matter. So the blood glucose goes up, which is not surprising. But it means that glucose does not enter the cells and they can't use it. So they start using fatty acids. And by using fatty acids, they're going to have accumulation of so-called acetoacetic acid, the metabolite, which causes acidosis, and without treatment, that leads to coma. Diabetic ketoacidosis, and that leads to coma. Now, glucagon is an opposite. It's also a water-soluble hormone, just like insulin. So it acts on the surface receptor. You don't need to know the mechanism. There will be no questions like that. So it actually works through G-protein coupled receptor, both resulting in the release of calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum and endoplasmic reticulum and production of cyclic AMP. Insulin effect, glucagon effects are opposite to insulin. If your blood glucose is low, glucagon will stimulate glycogenolysis, breakdown of glycogen, gluconeogenesis, synthesis of glucose from scratch, and lipolysis, breakdown of fat, inhibiting the opposite processes. So the processes that are stimulated will lead to the increase in blood glucose.